Hello to all of our listeners out there in the land of blockchain and otherwise. My name is Alex Manders, and I'm a director at the Information Services Group. My core responsibility is to lead and manage our ISG Blockchain Now Global and Services and Solutions line. And I'm joined with my two colleagues, Jason Stading and Cole Flashenberg, as we explore the world of blockchain with a number of guest speakers and leaders, specifically from Dole, Bear, MediLedger, Hashed Health, and Sprint. Our guest speakers are going to talk a lot about different applications and use cases as they relate to supply chain and otherwise, and we hope that you will find some value throughout the course of the series. The topic of today's podcast with Sprint was recorded prior to the Sprint and T-Mobile merger that occurred in 2020. Any and all of the ideas or topics captured within this podcast were done so prior to the Sprint and T-Mobile acquisition and are otherwise considered to be specific to Sprint at the time of recording. Many thanks and enjoy our podcast with Lyle and the Sprint organization. And we're excited today to have our guest, Mr. Lyle Paczkowski from Sprint. And before we jump into the questions, it would be great, Lyle, if you could give our listeners a little bit about yourself and Sprint and what you do with blockchain.
Absolutely. Thank you for inviting me to this call. This is a very, very important topic. So I'm at Sprint. I've been at Sprint 22 years and have been mostly in the core technology organization, which is the technology, innovation, and architecture group of Sprint that looks 2 to 5 years out, develops, or at least researches the technology, develops the technology, and hands off to other internal organizations for development and deployment. Been mostly in high sciences like this at Sprint for about half my career. The first part was when wireless first started at Sprint, and I was responsible for deploying a lot of the call center technologies back in the late 90s, early 2000s. Sprint is a great place to work, and of course now with the T-Mobile potential for merger, it's even going to be a lot better place to work.
Wonderful. And so, Lyle, I'm certainly honored for you to be joining us. In all my journeys, I often refer to Lyle as the Wizard of Oz with blockchain at Sprint. He by far is one of the more technically advanced individuals I've ever met with the technology of blockchain. And Lyle himself carries quite a few patents on the technology too. So hopefully the listeners find some value in our discussion today. And so with that, Lyle, I'd like to kind of kick it off and have you walk us through and the listeners on what is it that made you become interested with blockchain as an emerging technology? So how did you stumble upon it? What do you find exciting about it? Things of that nature.
Certainly. So, excited about blockchain or ledger technologies. I'd worked for several years on developing enterprise security paradigms around ARM and Intel systems, mostly around hardware-root trust. And we looked at how do we take hardware-root trust and apply it to server-based systems in the ecosystem like a carrier. And what we discovered, at least what I discovered, was that everything that was consistent about all the technologies we looked at was the notion of protecting data. And then beyond that, beyond the notion of protecting data as it's created, how do you protect the identity of those who created it, whether it's a carbon-based system or a silicon-based system? And so that's what really took me to the notion of blockchain. I was interested in the algorithm, how consensus was created and established, and this notion of anonymity, which kind of goes against the notion of identity. So that's really the start. I looked at the early phases of the fintech aspects of it, but more or less discarded the financial aspects or the transactional aspects, the money or the currency aspects of it, because it was becoming mature. And there wasn't much regulation that was going to govern that. So I discarded that notion and went into more or less the hyperledger forms of this, which is a micro-contract state. And that changes of state was what really compelled me to move forward on a network. What's important to a network is changes in state, not necessarily the financial transaction around it. And so that's where I really got my first start, was that notion of extension of security and of identity, changes in state on the network.
And so, Lyle, you and I have chatted many times in the past couple of years now, And the spectrum of blockchain applications is wide, and sometimes it can really start to confuse enterprises or individuals on even where to get started, or maybe even discourage some of them. So I'm curious to know what is it that has kept you excited about blockchain technology over the past several years, and what do you kind of foresee in the upcoming couple of years here as well?
Yeah, what keeps me excited about it is the fact that even though at least blockchain as we know it with for financial transactions has been around for a long time, it seems as if the ecosystem is past the hype cycle and is moving into the notion of rapid advancement or these changes in the technology. There's been a lot of modifications around how you originate and protect data. And that's what to me is really important is that the market is maturing, or at least the ecosystem is maturing around the central reason for a blockchain to begin with. And then secondly, as we get into the world of IoT, which stands for the inventory of things, we need to have identity for each of these little bits and pieces that comprise a network. So how do you create identities for appliances that are true, that are basically unhackable or immutable, plus then protect the data from those identities? And so I believe that we're at the very beginning of how we're going to develop Hyperledger blockchain, or at least even IOTA technologies in the future. It's just beginning, I feel. It's not 10 years old, it's just beginning.
No, and I would tend to agree with you there, and in particular or specific to your reference of IoT. And that kind of leads me to the question of within telecom and networking, Sprint's industry, what are some of the business models that you guys are exploring or that you're seeing come out with the firms that you work with? It sounds like some of those are going to be around IoT and kind of bundling blockchain with other advanced or emerging technologies. So what do you see, the future looking like for telecom networking as it relates to some of these new business models?
Yeah, there's several business models we think. So you mentioned telecom, the telecom and networking industry, which obviously would be the carriers, the big four. But what's happening is particularly with the advent of 5G, we're moving away from the telecom model to that of the Datacom model. This is the first time in the history of telephony that networks are now being designed not for voice, but for data as a first priority. And voice happens to become, it's still important, but it isn't the reason why we're designing networks. It's around data, moving data. And now, of course, with near cloud technologies and even some of the cloud technologies moving into the appliance, that's changing the paradigm of what a network is. And then 5G is really about orchestration, containerization, and virtualization, and that's different. And so all three of those predicates lead you to how do you gather data, move data, analyze data, and dispense data. So there's a large, or at least there is a global effort that is being initiated by 5G that leads us to how do we come up with different models in the back end. And so the use case is probably the most important one is this notion of true peer-to-peer business economy, and how does that affect supply chain? In fact, you're starting to hear and read about how the federal government is interested in supply chain technologies around the CMMI notion. And you're starting to see where large enterprises and even small enterprises are starting to move to this peer-to-peer economy where the buyer transacts the business based on the original manufacturer of it and slimlines the processes between. And so there's a lot of interesting business models that are probably ecosystem play rather than specific use cases. The use cases are many, right? There's dozens, if not hundreds, of use cases. But we're very interested in the business model.
And I want to kind of expand on something there real quick before I move to the next question, because I always learn something from you, always. And this is the first time I've heard the concept of Datacom. Could you maybe just define that again or elaborate on it, just for the listeners, because that's a new one for me.
Yeah, data. Well, thank you for that, because it's kind of a Lyleism.
Okay.
When you take a look, well, we're going to make it an ecosystem term, but Datacom means that what's important between. So 5G actually connects people to things, and today you might have a car that is owned by a corporation, or owned by an individual for sure, but owned by a corporation. In the future, on our network, a car will be a corporation, and it's going to connect to us in a variety of different fashions. But the data that it consumes or the data that creates has to go across a variety of different types of networks, whether it's car to car or car to network, from network to car. That data connection is the predicate for how you need to have a system function. So the physical attributes of 5G are coverage capacity and speed. You hear about 1 to 10 milliseconds of latency and the loss of or the lack of jitter. You're talking about massive coverage capabilities with 600 megahertz spectrums and massive data communication speeds with millimeter wave. Those are all the physical attributes, but the Datacom side of this is the logic that supports it, the data that is created. That's where the magic moment is. The future state of monetization isn't in the physical attributes of the network, because you're going to get those by default by any carrier any place in the world. What's going to differentiate us is how do we manage, manipulate, and dispense the data that is created by either the human elements or the silicon elements. And in our world, identity on those networks is going to be extremely important. In the Datacom world, today we identify IoT appliances on a network using an archived or an analog system of telephone numbers. Telephone numbers are globally discoverable, and that's really how original billing platforms were created to create services and for you to pay your bill. Well, there's not enough telephone numbers to go around for all the IoT appliances. So we have to create a different form of identity for them, and they're going to all be based on versions of Hyperledger, smart contracts, and maybe even Tangle capabilities. That's a remarkable statement. And then to couple all of that, what do you do about the data itself, the naming nomenclature? So Windows-based DOS systems for naming the data probably are obsolete. We have to investigate if we're going to create data, how do we name it and store it appropriately? So things like IPFS to me are extremely interesting and probably a Web 3.0 technology that we have to bring forward to accommodate 5G.
It's fascinating. I'm always fascinated by your perspectives, and again, even to the idea of naming all these IoT devices with new nomenclature, numerical sequences, and what that looks like for the world as we continue to expand the smart connected environments. It's pretty fascinating. But if we kind of go ahead and pull that back a little bit for the listener, again, the world of blockchain and the possibilities they're limitless depending on your perspective of the world. But if we take it back down to the normal person or group listening to the call, what are some of the quick wins that Sprint's customers have experienced with blockchain, or some of the quick wins that you've seen organizations achieve with the technology? Because a lot of times people they become to get overwhelmed with the art of the possible and don't even know how to measure return or value. So maybe walk us through where you've seen the value creation of blockchain legitimately or tangibly happen within Sprint's customers or client base, things along those lines.
Certainly, absolutely. Well, one of the quick wins are, of course, we being a partner with SoftBank, we have launched specifically in the PAC Rim a blockchain-based version of being able to do transactions with a mobile appliance. So it's a mobile app that uses a blockchain-based, a Byzantine methodology for consensus. Now, one of the things that, of course, blockchain has had a negative connotation around is its ability to scale. And so that's why we version this around the notion of minimum viable consensus. We don't need any more processing added to a network since we already do a lot of it there. We're trying to minimize the consensus. So we're looking at new technologies that allow for us to trust the user, trust the application, and trust the transaction and immute it forever so that we have an audit trail. That's really a quick win. The second big deal will be is if 5G is relevant globally, and it is, and when all networks become harmonized, we're going to have total integration. We're going to have to be able to move freely about networks and do things with our apps freely with appliances, and trust the data to be stored in a way that can't be found to be hacked.
You guys must process literally tens of millions of transactions at both the consumer and the enterprise level. How does blockchain play a role with the data security and storage aspects of all this, privacy, et cetera?
Yeah, great question, because legacy systems, all carrier systems, use today a process called call detail records, CDRs, to register how you consume services on a network. And when you say hundreds of millions of transactions, you're talking several billions of transactions on a day-to-day basis, not just a few hundreds of millions. The scale to which carriers have to function, all carriers, is extremely large. And billing platforms have been designed to accommodate that type of scale. So you have to ask yourself a question: if in the case of like blockchain as we know today, Bitcoin is limited on the number of transactions it can do in a half hour, how do you scale that to billions of transactions a day on any network? So the answer is we have to investigate different forms of math. We have to investigate different aspects of what data that we want to actually capture. So the notion of data deflection becomes an interesting component here. Not all data is necessary to go upon a network. So if we can give intelligence down to an individual appliance, for instance, a high science appliance, as I call it, maybe a car would be a good example. The cars today have, on average, about 50 processors in them. They have massive amounts of compute ability. In the future, if they become fully autonomous, they're going to have a range of network capabilities ever unseen. I mean, this is a new moonshot in terms of technology integration. And so we have to think about, how do we measure the detail that are coming from these high science appliances? And it can't be using a legacy system. It won't scale. So we have to allow for the machine to make a decision upon what data is important to be sent to the network for registering itself on a network. And secondly, what's important to be stored forever in an immutable record. And we see that starting to happen, whereas Intel and ARM are developing chip technologies that will move the network closer to the chip itself, or the silicon layer. And that's important to understand, because blockchain is a database system today, as we know it, scattered amongst thousands and thousands of servers. But what happens if we trust the appliance to the point where it can be a single blockchain element, that the data that it creates, because we know that the code is true and is golden, that we can trust the data from that becomes an important distinction. So moving it down into the near cloud, away from the cloud, there's no core anymore, moving it to the edge, as everybody calls it, and maybe even ultimately moving it into the silicon itself, is a really interesting philosophy and technological track that we see happening in the next 2 to 5 years.
This is fascinating in the sense that, the applications for blockchain are, again, at least in my mind, they're limitless, depending on the use cases being defined. And the dynamic that you're bringing here is that blockchain is in of itself a network that could otherwise support multiple networks. And so when we think about the people that are listening in on this podcast in the future that are sitting in enterprise IT organizations or a part of the networking group or the telecommunications group, what is it that you would like them to hear? What would be important for them to understand with what you're describing as blockchain relates to Sprint or any network of its type otherwise?
Oh, certainly. I think probably the big things that are all in all of our minds today, well, other than the coronavirus, would be things like how am I seen as an individual on a network? And or wait a minute, do I even want to be seen on a network? Because if I am seen on a network, I can be hacked. If you think about what happens in phishing attempts or whatever, the two things that are most important to bad actors, information that they want to get, is your user ID and password. Well, once you get that, you have access to everything behind that domain. And generally speaking, they're not so much interested in user ID and password, but what's behind it. Because I make the statement, I have an Excel spreadsheet because I have so many user IDs and passwords just to live today, that if someone were to steal that password file, by the way, you can't find it because it's hyperledger protected. But if you're able to find it, you would have access to everything that I know. And that's a problem for every single person who uses services on a network. And oh, by the way, everybody uses services on some form of a network. And not only you as a person, but all your silicon-based appliances as well in the future. Good grief, your refrigerator can order milk, and your washer and your laundry room can order soap. Those are identities that have a user ID and password someplace baked into the chain. And oh, by the way, lastly, every single user ID and password that I have are not mine, because those user IDs and passwords are on someone else's server. They aren't mine. They're someone else's. It is a right of admittance. So how do I trust that server on the other end with a name that I give it and a password that I associate with it to be true and trusted and protected? Hyperledger, blockchain, IOTA, Tango, and the whole variety of 3 dozens of consensus methods have to be deployed to do that. And lastly, with 5G coming aboard, and it's going to be a reality in the next five years particularly, is virtualization. So now things become virtual. They're no longer really real. And so virtualization creates another strong need for the ability to use blockchain and hyperledger technologies to protect the data, protect the identity behind the data, and ensure the code that creates the data is true.
Thank you. Yeah, very, a lot of information to process and very well thought out. As we move along, though, as we think about the different types of organizations and industries that are exploring blockchain, what perspective on industry verticals do you have that are using blockchain in the telecom network space or otherwise? So is there an industry more than another that you're seeing the things that you're working on as Sprint being adopted or not?
No, good question, Alex. There definitely is distinctions as we see it. We'll just kind of list 2 or 3 major ones, but it is obvious that manufacturing is going to benefit from this notion, particularly as it applies to supply chain technologies. Track and trace, we're already seeing it with things like green vegetables. If someone gets sick from a green vegetable, you can track backwards using Hyperledger to find the origination, the provenance, and attest to the state of the grower of that, or the transportation chain. I think that's really important. Manufacturing and the food chain are really, really important. Probably the second one that we see as a benefactor for this is going to emerge as a strong push for advancing the science is around healthcare and pharmacy. Obviously, the coronavirus is leading the charge today in terms of our awareness around health situations. But wouldn't it be nice to know whether the outfit that the nurse wore or the physician wore and all of the elements that you came around in a hospital had some form of identity, so you could track backwards provenance of where patient 0 existed or where they came from. How do we factor in these different verticals? That is manufacturing and healthcare and transportation and, oh gosh, the automotive segment. This is the moonshot, as I mentioned before. We are going to see a huge petri dish of needs come from how cars function and trucks and tractors on the farm function in the ecosystem on the network going forward. Things that we've never even contemplated are going to emerge in the next 2 years that we need to protect the data around.
Agreed. And thank you for your insights on the industry. It's very helpful, especially when we think about current state issues and that are going on that are affecting us all. References to other industries are very helpful for the listener as we roll out a number of different perspectives in this podcast series. So with that said, I want to tee up my trusted teammates here to also ask you a couple questions, Lyle. So I'm going to defer to Mr. Cole Flashenberg for the next question.
Sure. Hey, Lyle. So how are you seeing organizations use blockchain to either enhance or complement other technologies within their industry or their enterprise?
That's a good question. I have the luxury here at Sprint of being in contact with many of our customers, Fortune 50, Fortune 100, and down to smaller SMB facilities. And the need that they have is a consistent one. If I have my data behind my firewall, I know it is safe until it is stolen. If I move my data above my firewall into a cloud-based system, I know it is safe. I think I trust them until it is stolen. This idea of being able to mute your data so that even if it is taken, it can't be used or can't be seen is something that we see all the time. We used to have customers come in all the time to our executive briefings and ask about handset plans and and appliances and devices like that, voice appliances. But today, we seldom hear about that. The questions that we have coming in is, how should we invest in technologies that protect our data? What systems, what servers should we be buying that do that? How do we create certificates of authority to lock down roots of trust on these appliances? Oh, what are some of the principles around platform security architecture that we should be deploying and getting ourselves certified that we can indemnify our processes and our data? And can you sell me some crypto and cyber warranty policy so if I do have an incursion or lose data, I'm protected? These are all really interesting questions to us as a former telecom and now a Datacom company.
All right, so I'm going to turn it over to my teammate here, Mr. Jason Stady.
Hey, Lyle. We thank you very much for coming on. This has been incredibly fascinating. My question is, what should our listeners take away in terms of how blockchain and emerging technologies are shaping the future of telecommunications and networking?
Well, I tell you, I love that question because it's an easy answer. There is not enough time in the day to study this technology. You must look at this constantly, have a goal that every day you look at a new event on Google or on the Google or Bing or whatever you use for your web scraper. And I would also suggest that staff in your organizations that have a coding or some sort of experience start looking at how basically code in this space. You don't have to really understand Bitcoin math. You just have to understand how do you protect your data. And learning and listening from the people who are emerging as experts is really critical here.
Lyle, as we move along, I want to tee it up for a series of questions that we're asking each of our guests, and I want to start with the first one from Cole. So Cole, go ahead.
Sure. So, Lyle, what's a low technology hobby that you have and enjoy doing in your off time?
I think probably all of us on this call, probably all your listeners, just by the very nature of what we do, are very curious people. I would say that probably most people are fairly creative. They are interested in things that they don't know about. And I think things like photography, particularly for myself, photography is a science that is probably being forgotten because everybody has a camera on their cell phone and you take a picture for archive. But I think the science of photography is fascinating to me, how you blend light and use light. And then probably the other thing is I really like messing around with wood. And I have two welders in my residence at home, which drives people crazy. I like to work with metal and build things with my hand, and it probably is an extension of creativity that hasn't anything to do with blockchain or Hyperledger or Tangle.
Yeah, that's pretty cool, Lyle. Jason and I are sitting in my dining room right now on a table that I made as well. So that's kind of cool that we share a similar hobby. So yeah, wonderful. Thank you, Lyle. So Jason.
I definitely agree. It's a beautiful reclaimed Texas pecan wood table. It's amazing. My next question is if you could create a technology to do something that you really don't like to do, what would it be?
Yeah, well, okay. So, and again, here, this is to all the listeners. Doesn't everybody hate to do TPM reports? I mean, good grief. I don't know that we have to write everything down. Yeah, that's a little bit of a glib response, but I think, so I just bought for my home a Bose sound system, and it would seem to me that there has to be a more laminar process from acquisition to registering it to warranty to troubleshooting, and I think that there's a gap there. It seems to me that would be very nice for the economy to try, for all the manufacturers of goods and services, to try to economize or at least simplify that process of acquisition. That I always have to write down the website and the password to the website and the date I bought something. It seems to me that that information is just data that could easily be captured and shared among all those that I do business with, whether it's a Samsung TV that uses this system or my Wi-Fi router that attaches to the TV. There's no integration there, and I believe that that's going to come eventually. It's hard to do for sure, but that would be a magnificent result of how we use science of the inventory of things.
Absolutely, I love it. That's a great idea.
Yeah, that would definitely help me as well.
Likewise.
All right. So my final question is around kind of your career and what's an aspiration in your career that you have had, and whether it be technology related or non-technology related.
Well, that's an interesting question because there also is a bit of fear as you step away from what you know. But I think it would be really, really interesting to try to create a product that would be a startup sufficient thing. I'd like to be the next Facebook, but I'm not in social media. But some form of technology adaptation that would find its way into at least the ecosystem and be usable in some fashion. That's always a kind of a goal for all of us. Absolutely, when we're in the technology business like we are. But I have not been able outside of work to create something that I could go to market with and sell for $5.
What can we buy for $5?
I guess a
Starbucks.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, Starbucks, right? Your basic coffee anymore. Jason.
So, what is your favorite technology application or device right now? Sounds like you just got a brand new Bose sound system, but curious what your favorite
Yeah,
one.
yeah. So I think so. What really kind of appeals to me is this notion of mapping. Mapping really has come about because of fast network responses and the ability to store images. I mean, you can go any place. And before you go there, you can almost see the whole city just by walking through it on a map. Mapping technology to me is kind of an interesting blend of a lot of different things, and that's to me is a fascinating application in terms of a device or an appliance. I guess I got to tell you, I love all the appliances and I love all devices, even though they're pesky and sometimes difficult to work with, and sometimes don't function at all. But I think that the technology applications, when it comes to human need and solving for our human needs, mapping is really something that's really been way cool, at least in my mind. There are other things, of course, but that has to be my favorite application.
I think I would agree. I think before I went to Vegas, I virtually walked using Google Maps all the way up and down the Las Vegas Strip so I could orient myself before I got there.
I do the same thing. I do the same thing with client cities and any city I'm visiting.
Wow. Huh, I never even heard that. We're all learning something new today, Lyle.
Yeah.
So Lyle, I got one last question here for you, and before we all sign off. Again, you've been doing this for a long time. There is a extraordinary amount of information in the market that is either good, perhaps of 100%, maybe 10% of it is truly insightful. 90% of it seems to not be as value add. What would you suggest your listeners do, or where they should go to get good information on blockchain, industry trends, things that you yourself look at? Because that would be a big win for everybody to know, hey, the Wizard of Oz or Sprint, he gets his blockchain information and insights from A, B, and C. What would A, B, and C be?
Yeah, that's actually a great question. I've asked that a lot. I am asked that question a lot by those who come to visit Sprint and with the partners and vendor that I work with. But look at if you when you get out of high school, you go to college to learn more. In college, you are taught things. In high school, you're taught things. In college, you're taught how to think. And I think that the answer to your question is actually to come to companies like ISG. You guys, your company, your firm, your analysts go talk to others who are smart, maybe even smarter in the science than you are, and you gather that information. You're the college. You're the information 101 when it comes to the bare minimum of what you need to know, and then you also have levels 2, 3, and 4. I think that's what we rely upon in Sprint. We commonly and routinely listen to those who are expert in this space because we aren't. Go to the reputable firms who have skills and expertise and credibility in coming up with at least an opinion about the technology. I mean, we're in a business that 2 to 5 years from now, we either are going to be right or we're going to be wrong. But 2 to 5 years from now, no one will know the difference. We have to do something now. We have to learn it now so we can apply it for the 2 to 5 year span. And I rely upon companies like ISG and others as my base information. And from there, then I talk to individual experts as I can find them. it's a continual movement in terms of learning new technology and new sciences.
Fantastic. And so, Lyle, we certainly appreciate all your time today. I assume you're in Kansas City, right?
I am. Yep.
All right. Well, we hope all is well with you in Kansas City. We're gonna wrap up here from Austin, Texas, and we'll look forward to being in touch with you soon.
Absolutely. Thank you guys for inviting me, from myself and for that of Sprint. We appreciate our interactions and our association with a great company like ISG, and continue to look forward to our future engagements.
Well, we hope you found today's podcast episode valuable and insightful. And on behalf of the Information Services Group, Jason Stating and Cole Flashenberg, we'd like to thank you for listening, and we encourage you to listen to the future episodes. And also, with any questions you might have about ISG or ISG Blockchain Now, please visit isg1.com to learn more about our firm and what we do with blockchain. Thank you.